Charting the Internet's Next Economic and Cultural Frontier with Alex Tapscott is the show we have for you today. Alex is an entrepreneur, business author, and seasoned capital markets professional focused on the impact of emerging technologies. Alex joined us today to discuss his book, Web3, Charting the Internet's Next Economic and Cultural Frontier. In this episode, we discuss the Web3 revolution, NFTs, decentralized finance, and so much more. If you want to understand what's happening on the internet and with Web3, this is a conversation you don't want to miss. Good morning, Alex. Welcome to the Growth Guide. For our listeners who don't know you yet, can you give us a brief bio and rundown on yourself?
Yeah, sure. So I was born in Toronto, Canada, downtown. Grew up here, throughout my youth and childhood. Played a lot of sports growing up. Was a rugby player and a football player. Got recruited to play football in the U.S. at a university. So spent 4 years at Amherst College in Massachusetts, where I studied a variety of different things, everything from philosophy to political science to film studies and economics. So naturally, I took this diverse sort of liberal arts education and applied it to the one area where I had no experience and no practical knowledge whatsoever, which was financial services. So straight out of undergrad, I got recruited to join an investment bank in Toronto called Canaccord Genuity. And my dad likes to joke that I didn't know an asset from a hole in the ground, which in a way was kind of true. I had no real experience of financial services, but I was always very curious about it and, interested in learning more about something new. And so I kind of dove in and turned out I loved it and I had a knack for it. And so I spent 7 years working in investment banking, first in Toronto and then later in Toronto and New York, where I split time. In the business, it was an area of the business called equity capital markets. So my job was to talk to institutional investors and to give them ideas on where to invest their money. This is what they call like wholesale finance, large dollar values in the sort of tens and hundreds of millions of dollars. In 2014, while I was enjoying my, time in that role, I first learned about this thing called Bitcoin. This is before the word blockchain or Web3 entered the vernacular. There was really just this one new asset, and it was still pretty early stage. So at the time, the market capitalization of Bitcoin, so like the total value of all the Bitcoin out there, was maybe $4 or $5 billion, which sounds like a lot of money, but in the context of almost any other asset class, is a tiny amount. Like it's a rounding error. Just to put it into context, in the U.S. they have this thing called the S&P 500. It's an index of the 500 largest companies. And at the time, Bitcoin wouldn't have even made the 500 largest companies in the U.S. So it's very small, new kind of asset. But I was very curious about it because there was a lot of media coverage and there was a lot of interest in it. And a lot of really smart people were convinced that this was not just a new asset, but maybe a new technology paradigm that was going to change the world. And so I was, okay, I'm going to look into this and see what's going on. And yeah, they say, you fall down these rabbit holes, what have you. I basically became convinced after spending some time looking at Bitcoin that this was not just a new asset, not just a way to, maybe make money or speculate or whatever, but that it was a new era of the internet, that the underlying technology of Bitcoin, blockchains, could potentially usher in an internet of value where previously none existed. And I'll explain what I mean by that. But just to go on a slight side tangent, the timing of this was all very good because right around this time, I was kind of contemplating like a next move out of my career. And this new kind of thing had emerged. And I thought, wow, maybe I could make a go of it here. But I didn't really know what jobs were available. This was at a time when, the VC investing side of crypto, of Bitcoin, was tiny. So there weren't like a lot of new companies being formed. And so I found this really great way to jump into the space, which is I, with my dad, collaborated on some research looking at how Bitcoin could help maybe solve global problems. Maybe it was a new technology that could unleash capability in the economy. And that research became the basis for a book that we ended up writing together called Blockchain Revolution. So that book came out in 2016. They say, better lucky than smart. The book came out at the perfect time when a lot of people were really curious about this. technology and this asset class and beyond just the tech world, business, government, journalists, people in the arts, creative industries, and so forth. And this was really the first book to explain to a mainstream audience how the underlying technology of Bitcoin blockchain is going to change money, business, and the world. I'll stop there because it goes on and on and on. But that was really my starting off point on this new journey where I'm focusing on the impact of emerging technologies on business.
And I love it because that's where we'll spend most of our time today. So
Yeah.
we will get some of that energy as we talk about Web3. So why don't we dive right into Web3? And what I'm thinking there, Alex, is let's take our readers conceptually through this idea of the evolution from Web 1 to Web 2 to Web 3. As you write, we used to have CBS, NBC, ABC. Now we have Facebook, Google, Amazon, and Apple. Where's it going? How does this all work?
Well, I'm glad you asked because I've got a new book coming out in September and I appreciate the plug. So, first off, the internet and the web are slightly different things. So, I'll start with the internet. The internet itself was actually invented in the late 1960s as a project that was spearheaded by the Department of Defense in the US. And the reason that they built the internet was that they wanted to create a decentralized communication network that would stay up and running in the event of a Soviet nuclear attack. So at the time, all telecommunications were running through one central node in New York City. And the concern was if the Soviets could knock out that central node, then the government couldn't send launch codes to all the different locations to, create a counterattack. So they funded a project run out of a couple of universities in California. And in a way, that sort of founding story helped to influence the internet in its early years. It was really a tool that was used by people in government in the not-for-profit sector, but really like academia and scientists. And it wasn't until 1989, with the invention of this thing called the World Wide Web by computer scientist Tim Berners-Lee, that the web became a commercial tool that was widely used by regular people and by businesses. And that was given a huge boost in the early 1990s with the launch of the web browser. So the first web browser was the Mosaic browser, which later became Netscape. So the first era of the Web 1, which I think commonly think of as the .com era, and what I refer to as the read web, was really just a platform for consuming content. It was a broadcast medium. So you would go online and you would, access early websites, and it was a way to access information. So you could access, the sports scores and the weather and the classifieds, and you could go into Britannica online, or you could seek out other information that people, had uploaded. But in general, it was pretty static. And it was pretty one way. You couldn't interact with websites. You couldn't reprogram them. People weren't really using the web as a way to build community. There wasn't a huge amount of user-generated content that was being generated online. It was all pretty much one way. So despite being fairly limited, it was still revolutionary in that it kind of democratized access to information, at least for those people who had an internet connection, which wasn't everybody. In fact, at the time was, only 40 million people or something in the mid-1990s. In the early 2000s, early to mid 2000s, the combination of evolving user behavior, sort of a growing sophistication combined with some new technologies created the conditions for a new web, Web 2. So Web 1 was the read web. Web 2 is the read write web. So the web became not only a way to consume information and content, but became a tool for individuals to upload their own content, to in effect reprogram the web. And so the early sort of examples of this, things like, say, Wikipedia, where by harnessing the wisdom of crowds and the input of many people working together, we're able to create, big, new, important, valuable resources like Wikipedia. And the early success of a lot of those Web 2 projects, I think, filled people with a sense of hope that the web would be a new kind of tool that would usher in a halcyon age of mass collaboration that would, change the world in some important ways. And in many ways it did, and in many ways it did not. And one of the reasons for that was that a lot of the, attention, a lot of the data, a lot of the content that people were contributing to the web was captured by a handful of very large intermediaries, platforms, basically, that harnessed all of that data and then sold it to advertisers. And in a way, advertising kind of became like the killer app or like the killer business case for the internet.
Yeah.
Where, we've got all these people that are uploading all this useful information and data. That's just something that's going to be valuable to advertisers. And in the book, you're right, you point out this comparison, which is not my quote. It's a quote from someone else, but whose name is escaping me at the moment. But basically the idea was that, in the old days, the broadcast medium of pre-internet, there were a handful of, central arteries of communication networks. And today, weirdly, despite the fact that the web is supposed to be this open platform, a lot of information and news and content flows through a handful of huge pipes online. And then those companies today kind of wield almost more power, oddly enough, than their analog counterparts from before. So that's Web 1 and Web 2. So with Web 3, the internet is entering a new era, from a read web to a read-write web to a read-write-own web. And the read-write-own web basically empowers individuals to own the most valuable assets of the digital age. And that means owning data, owning their identities, and owning virtual or digital assets. And virtual or digital assets can take many, many different forms. They can be everything from, the content that people purchase online to the assets that they purchase in virtual worlds or video games, to financial assets like money or stocks and bonds, which they use online as a medium of exchange or a unit of account or a way to store value. All of those assets, we now have a way to express those assets digitally. And this new ownership layer of the web is going to have a huge impact on business and on society. Business especially, every era of the web has proven to be massively disruptive for many different companies. It's created all sorts of new champions, and it's also disintermediated or disrupted or undermined the business model of a lot of companies. And I think Web3 is going to do something similar.
So a big part of it seems to come down to property rights and moving from renters to owners. Does that sound right, Alex?
That is right. We haven't really had a way to express digital property rights. And interestingly enough, property rights are a precondition for wealth creation. If you don't know that you reliably own an asset, then you're not going to, spend money investing in it. Think of a house. Like, if I don't know that I really have the title to that home, am I really going to do renovations to it? Am I going to upgrade it? Am I going to rent it out when at any point in time someone can challenge my ownership to that? So we have a system of laws and rules that have been built up over many centuries in the traditional economy that govern property rights. Online, we didn't have that kind of a regime. And as a result, and we also had a new kind of value that was being created that wasn't kind of properly categorized yet. No one had figured out how to codify the value of data and of time and of attention and of our identities. And what blockchains enable basically is a way to program value into digital goods. So the most important innovation of blockchains are these things called tokens. Now, token is a word that makes it sound like it's sort of a trivial thing, like a token of my appreciation or something like that. But actually, it turns out that the term is both appropriate and kind of foundational. So you can think of tokens basically as a vessel for value or container for value, in the same way that a website is a container for information. So a website can be programmed to contain anything of information. It can be, a storefront. It can be the newspaper. It could be the classifieds. It could be an encyclopedia. It can be whatever, the landing page for a big company or something like that. And in the same way that we can program a website to do basically anything, represent anything of information, we can do the same for tokens to represent anything of value. And in the book, Web3, which conveniently you have right behind you on that lovely background of yours, we talk about our token taxonomy, or my token taxonomy, which basically breaks down all the different ways that tokens are being used today to represent value. Now, the token taxonomy has 11 different types, and I think it's useful to understand tokens in the context of this kind of a breakdown. But I think eventually the idea of a taxonomy of tokens is going to be silly, in the same way that it would be kind of silly to say, here are the 10 ways that you can use a website. A website can do this, a website can do that. Like a website could be anything. Like right now, we're using a website as a podcast recording studio. I'm not totally sure that people anticipated that 20 years ago.
That's right.
And so in the same way that, websites are ways to program information or content, voice, video, and so forth, and text, obviously, tokens are a way to express things of value. So they can represent money, they can represent titles and deeds to property, they can represent art, collectibles, they can represent virtual assets purchased inside video games, like say skins or weapons or shields or anything like that. They can represent dollars or real world assets, stable coins being the most prominent example of that, worth over $200 billion in circulating supply. So there's all these different examples of how smart innovators and companies and others are figuring out how to use this new tabula rasa to, paint their own picture, basically.
And what would you say? So you have this taxonomy in the book, but I mean,
Yeah.
we're not going to go through 10 different ways that you can use it. But what would you say are the top 2 to 3 ways that you see tokens being used today, or the best use case from your perspective early on to build widespread adoption?
Yeah, well, I think probably stablecoins is the one thing that has most successfully exported tokens to the mainstream. So there are tons of really cool examples of how tokens are being used. NFTs, people have probably heard of those, non-fungible tokens, mostly used today for art and collectibles or virtual assets in metaverse environments. But in general, still pretty nichey. Like I think maybe, a few million people are doing that. There's other areas like DeFi, decentralized finance, where people are earning value in new financial applications and platforms, which is also interesting. But really, it's been stable coins where the rubber has hit the road. So a stablecoin, oddly enough, is basically just a token that is pegged to or backed by some real world asset. Typically, it's the US dollar, though that's changing. There are lots of other examples of ones backed by euros or gold or oil or some other asset. And basically, they become a way for people to move and store and save and manage dollar assets globally in a frictionless peer-to-peer way. So that might sound like, well, don't we already have that? People use Venmo to move money back and forth. That's true in the United States for people who are banked. So that's a subset of people in the world. But as a whole, globally, there's tons of friction and barriers to moving value around the world because we're using a legacy financial system that in some respects is using technology that's many decades old. So stablecoins basically disintermediate or remove the need for any of the existing legacy financial infrastructure. So just to put it into context, depending on who you ask, there are, at least 100 million people who have used US dollar stablecoins. That's at least according to the State of the Union report from one of the biggest issuers, a company called Circle. The number is probably higher than that based on, data gathering you see from a lot of countries in the world. In places like, say, Turkey or in Nigeria or in large parts of Latin America, stablecoins are seen as a way to protect against inflation risk. They're seen as a way to store value when people don't have access to bank accounts, as a way to maybe move money out of a country in the event of political turmoil, right? So we are very privileged, Clint, you and me, we live in Canada, probably one of the most peaceful countries that there is, but not everybody has that lived experience. And so this is a classic example of how technology is flattening the world. They say that this is something Thomas Friedman came up with in his book, The World is Flat, that basically the spread of globalization and capital and technology makes the world flatter. It makes it easier for people around the world to participate more fully in the global economy. I think that is more of a promise than it is a reality. But I think that with Web3, technology really is flattening the world. I think Web3 is actually a steamroller that is making it possible for everyone to compete and to exist on a much more level playing field. And I just think stablecoins are one of a dozen examples of that.
And so something else you talked about in there was this idea of NFTs. And so people probably hear NFTs all the time, but they may not understand that that stands for non-fungible tokens. Can you give a high-level contrast between what is a fungible token, which is most of Web3, and what is this concept of non-fungible token?
Well, you got to give it to the Web3 community. They excel at just the most awful jargony, naming conventions. So non-fungible token. I can't imagine a less appealing thing to say. But anyway, So very briefly, a fungible token is something where there are many of a token and where those are easily interchangeable. So a fungible asset is something that can be exchanged readily for something of the same kind. I'll give you an example. If you have a dollar bill or a toonie or something, and I have a toonie, that's the Canadian $2 coin. We can trade those toonies and it doesn't make a difference, right? Like your toonie is fungible with my toonie. Your dollar bill is fungible with my dollar bill. My share of Apple is fungible with your share of Apple. There are millions and millions and millions and millions of shares of Apple. There are billions and billions of dollar notes in circulation. And so these things are liquid and they can be interchanged. Something that is non-fungible, a piece of art, your home, even the deed or the mortgage to your home is an asset that can't readily be exchanged for another asset. You might live in a subdivision or an apartment building, right, or a condo building, right, where there's 500 units in this condo building and they're all the same size, but they don't all sell for the same price because every single unit has got some different feature aspect to it that makes it unique, right? And that is true for lots of assets. Lots of assets in the world are non-fungible. They can't be readily exchanged. You won't just swap your house with someone else's house because it makes no difference. There's all this other value that is unique to that asset. So non-fungible tokens are simply a way to express that concept of non-interchangeability digitally. So that means that they can be used for lots of different kinds of assets that are unique or not easily exchangeable for something else, which is why in the early sort of days of NFT innovation, people have been using it largely for art, especially for graphic design. A lot of graphic artists who work in a purely digital medium don't have an easy way to kind of monetize the value of their creation. If you're a painter, a sculptor, or something, you can sell a unit of your work, and it is painted on a canvas that can be purchased by someone else. If you're a digital artist that works in a purely digital medium, well, I suppose someone could buy a copy, but then they could just copy and paste it. And this is an image that anybody can recreate. And since it's intended to be displayed on a screen, then anybody with a screen can display it. So an NFT is basically a way to ascribe a unique identifier to a virtual asset or digital asset. In the same way that in the context of art, you can think of it kind of as like the signature from the artist. It's basically a way to verify that this is the one-of-one digital asset, this is the unique single or initial version of it. And that becomes a really unique way for creators to monetize the value that they're creating, by using digital tools. And it becomes a way for collectors or speculators or, buyers to prove ownership of something that is authentic. So that's the first kind of example of where NFTs became popular. They later became more popular with these things called profile picture projects, PFP projects, which basically were communities where people could purchase assets that were similar but different in subtle ways. And the rarer the asset, the more valuable it was, according to the rule, the marketplace at the time. And these kinds of communities built around these concepts basically became ways to build what they call token gated communities, where if you're a holder of a token, you have access to benefits of this community, you have access to special perks or events or to experiences that are unique. In the same way that joining a country club or being a member of the Soho House might give you special access to benefits and cachet and cultural relevance. The same is true for these kinds of NFT projects as well. In the book, we interview this brilliant person. His name's Yat Su, and he's one of the most prolific sort of backers of NFT projects. And he basically said that, if Bitcoin was a store of value, then an NFT is a store of culture. It is a way to express cultural value in token form. One example from the book, which to me really brought home the impact, the societal impact of tokens and NFTs, was about this young boy named Sevi, who lives in the Philippines. So he's 9 years old, and he wouldn't mind me telling the story because we asked their permission to include it in the book. But I had a long conversation with his mom a few months ago when I was doing the research for the book. And she told me about Sevi. So Sevi is a 9-year-old boy who's autistic. And he lives in Manila, and his parents have been trying to help him with treatment for his condition. And one of those treatments is art therapy. And so he's been doing art therapy for many, many months, along with, sports and other forms of therapy. Now, his parents were unable to afford all of these different kinds of therapy. And they basically asked Sevi to choose for them, which one do you want to continue? And he chose art. So he was painting with the assistance of his instructor, who's someone who's used to dealing with autistic children and helping them through this. And his artwork was starting to catch the attention of, friends and family who saw that he was posting photos of his paintings online, and they're saying, "Oh, isn't that cool? Like, we'd love to support Sevi. Maybe we can buy a copy of his artwork." So initially just started as a friends and family thing. But part of the treatment for art therapy is that Sevi wants to hold on to the pieces of art, and he likes to hang them in his own room or to give them to members of his family, like his sisters. That's what his preference is. And so, the answer is kind of thanks, but no thanks. But pretty soon, a couple of people in the Filipino Web3 community kind of caught wind of this and said, there's this kid, he's doing this art, there's a market for it. Maybe they'd be interested in making an NFT of his art. And his mom was first question was, "What's an NFT?" and had no concept of this. I mean, this all started because it was just art therapy for Sevi, not because it was supposed to be some kind of commercial thing. So she's like, I really don't know. And so she asked, her husband, they talked about it and talked to Sevi about it. And everyone's like, yeah, I guess we'll just see how it goes, So they listed some NFTs of Sevi's artwork on OpenSea, which is one of the bigger platforms. And much to their shock and surprise, people really connected to the story. They thought it was so interesting that there's this kid who is using art as a way to communicate when sometimes other tools fail him. And all of a sudden they were selling their art. Now, we're not talking about big dollar figures, a few $100 maybe here or there, but it was enough that NFT New York, which is the big art festival for digital artwork, caught wind of this and basically invited Sevi to display his at Art NFT NYC. So quite a surreal moment, but basically Sevi's artwork is now, or a year ago, was in Times Square on 100-foot billboards in the middle of New York. Now, and in the end, he's ended up selling a lot of his art. Now, interestingly, his story emerged at a time when child artists were kind of having a bit of a moment. There was a story about the baby Picasso in New York or something that was selling his art for $100,000. This isn't so much a comment on the value of art or on kid art or that, or the other, but it's just a point. The point that I'm making is that, in the Web 2 world, Sevi had a way to broadcast that he was an artist, to connect with fans, to share images of his art. But he didn't have a way to monetize it. There was no economic toolkit at his disposal that would allow him to actually, make some money from this, or his family to make some money from this while still retaining the original for the purpose of his therapy. Now, this doesn't mean that every child artist that scribbles something on a piece of paper is going to be able to monetize it. It's not that the art itself is scalable, but the model is scalable. The idea that if you're a creator, regardless of where you are in the world, whether you're living in Toronto or Vancouver or Berlin or Tokyo, or if you're a 9-year-old boy with autism living in Manila, you have a way to harness this new economic toolkit to tap into a global marketplace. And that's when I say technology is flattening the world and Web3 is flattening the world. To me, this is the most perfect kind of encapsulation of that. Incidentally, as a result of all of this, Sevi has sold, I think, maybe $12,000 worth of art in the last couple of years, which is more than the average annual income of a family living in Manila, where he lives. So it's material for his family and has helped to kind of set them up for the type of art therapy that he wants to do. And now that they've, thanks to NFTs, pretty much, they're able to give him everything he needs, which I think is pretty inspiring.
Oh, I love that story. Let's tackle a couple of the things that we need to have in place to allow the Web3 economy to work. So we've talked about tokens.
Yeah.
A couple of the other ones that jump out at me are that listeners will need as much education on as I do. The idea of consensus algorithms and smart contracts. Those two seem to be a bit of the backbone of how everything works.
Yeah.
What do those look like?
For sure. So maybe just to take a step back, what's a blockchain? So
yeah,
because ultimately, think about, let's just start with the token for a second. So for the token to have value, we need to know that it is scarce, provably scarce, right? Like if I have a token that represents $1, but I can send that dollar 100 times to 100 different people, if it stops being scarce, then it ceases to have value. So we need a way to be able to program scarcity digitally onto the internet. And the way that we do that is with a blockchain. So normally in transactions between individuals, using banks and credit cards and so on and so forth, there's intermediary, there's a middleman that sits in the center. Now, these middlemen, typically are banks, but increasingly include a lot of large digital conglomerates and technology companies that have become the economic choke points in our economy. And these intermediaries are responsible for doing something very important, which is they need to maintain a ledger of transactions between different people, who owes what to whom, who owns what, and so forth. And for maintaining this ledger of transactions, they are compensated. They earn fees, they earn rents, they get to hold value on behalf of other parties, which they can earn interest on. All of that is because they act as a trusted intermediary and a maintainer of the ledger. Now, these intermediaries do a decent job, but they have several limitations. They're centralized, which makes them vulnerable to hacking or to attack. They add friction and slow things down. They exclude big parts of the population, and they capture all this data about users. So a blockchain solves this problem. So rather than an intermediary maintaining a ledger, a blockchain is a distributed or decentralized ledger of transactions. And instead of existing in one place, like inside of a business or a bank, it exists on any computer that is connected to the network, and it is available for all to see. Now, here's where it gets interesting. Anybody can access the ledger, anyone can see transactions in it and can verify that those transactions are real, but no single entity can alter the blockchain or add a transaction. Only way that that can happen is by the whole network reaching consensus. Basically, every node on the network kind of needs to give a thumbs up to every transaction before it is swept and added to the blockchain. Now, this process, this consensus algorithm, has various different types, right? The most popular, most familiar one, I think, to a lot of people, even those who aren't in this space, is proof of work. So even if you haven't heard of proof of work, you may have heard of Bitcoin miners. So Bitcoin miners are these entities on the network that commit large computing power, large computing resources to basically maintaining the ledger and validating transactions in the network. And in exchange for maintaining the ledger and validating transactions, they are rewarded. In the case of Bitcoin, with new Bitcoin that gets added periodically. Now, proof of work has many advantages. It is extremely secure. In order to rewrite, if you wanted to hack the Bitcoin blockchain and rewrite the history of commerce, you'd have to marshal more computing power than you'd have to take over basically the biggest computing network in the world, which is the Bitcoin network. And you'd have to do it in 10 minutes in the full light of day with everyone trying to stop you. And then after 10 minutes, when a new block gets added, you'd have to start all over again. So that's why the Bitcoin blockchain itself has never had any kind of compromise or hack, is because it's extremely secure. But you pay for that security in the form of its carbon footprint. So large, node, like all these different computing nodes working to validate transactions and add blocks to the ledger means that it's going to cost a lot in energy. Without getting into too much detail, the Bitcoin network does use majority of renewable fuel simply because if energy is your most important cost input, you want to get it where it's free or nearly free. And that typically occurs near like co-locating near like hydroelectric dams or whatnot. But the key point is that it uses a lot of energy. So that's led to the creation of a new kind of consensus mechanism called proof of stake. Ethereum is the second largest crypto network, is the system that uses proof of stake along with others, but that's the biggest one. And rather than using large computing rather than having nodes that use large computing power, basically Ethereum network functions by everyone who's in the network staking the tokens that they have to the network. And so long as they act with integrity and update the ledger and validate transactions, they get to earn a modest income from that. And if they decide to do anything nefarious, then they could potentially lose the tokens that they stake. So in a way, you can think of it this way. Rather than paying a bank to maintain the ledger and having them earn all the fees, It's a user-owned network for everyone who's connected to it can do the same thing and earn a portion of that fee instead. So it's a way to distribute the wealth in a system to the users rather than to a single intermediary or to a single company. And that is a system that has worked exceptionally well. The Ethereum network has a market capitalization of $200 billion. For our Canadian listeners, that's 3 times as big as Shopify, the most successful tech company in Canada. And there's also the platform where dozens of applications are getting built. So proof of stake works. And I think probably with the exception of Bitcoin, proof of stake is the future of how blockchains are going to scale. And I think that's important for a couple of reasons. One is that, it just reduces the carbon footprint. And if you care about the planet, then that's something that should be important to you. Number two, the fact that it doesn't use any more data than your average data center or more energy means that enterprises and customers that had concerns about that no longer have concerns about that. And that's why we're seeing an explosion of Web3 innovation in big companies like Nike and LVMH and Pepsi and Starbucks and so forth. And then number 3 is that it can potentially scale a lot better. So it can potentially, be used as a tool for all different manner of applications that use tons of transactions or only a few transactions per minute or per second. It basically is a way to grow it to meet Web3's immense potential.
And when we start to think about that, as you describe it, essentially it's just a ledger. It's replacing the intermediary that we're paying that's taking rents with an electronic version of the same thing that we can rely on. Thanks for listening. If you enjoy what you're hearing so far and want me to be able to get your favorite guests on this show, please do me a quick favor. Subscribe to the show and leave me a rating. The 30 seconds of your time will mean a ton to me.
Yeah, in effect, rather than trusting an intermediary to maintain a record of transactions, everyone in the network works together to do that. It is a way to distribute trust in a network rather than in the hands of a single third party.
And so you talked about Bitcoin not being hacked, and 2 things that jump out at me that I read from you that were important are 1, that it's permissionless, and 2, that it's censorship resistant.
Yeah.
What do you mean by those?
So permissionless means that if you have a device connected to the internet, you can use these networks. You don't have to go open an account or log in or sign up by providing all this data and information about yourself. You can access it if you're living in Toronto or if you're living in the Philippines. And you can use this toolkit freely in the same way that you can freely use the internet, right? Or in the sense that you can download a web browser and access websites. So the web itself is permissionless, even if companies and applications that are built on top of it are not. And blockchains are permissionless as well. Censorship resistant means that transactions, because trust is distributed and decentralized in one of these networks, no single actor can cancel a transaction or hold it up or reverse it. So in the case of a traditional system, you have an intermediary that sits in the middle and is able to, stop a transaction, reverse a transaction, and so forth. With blockchains, those transactions are very difficult, if not impossible, to censor. And so they can occur peer-to-peer without the need for intermediaries and without fear of them being stopped. Now, that creates all sorts of really interesting questions about blockchains. Permissionless systems are great for people who are trying to send money overseas or trying to store value in a system, in a political system or government which is corrupt. But also, we can make the point that, if a criminal could use it, right, to move value peer-to-peer in a permissionless way that makes it difficult for, government or a company to prevent it or to stop it. That is a concern that people have raised about digital assets and tokens. It's a concern that, while legitimate, I think has no real basis in the reality of how blockchains work. It turns out, according to the most authoritative source on the subject, Chainalysis, that, tokens are used in criminal activity very rarely, less so than cash or credit cards or any other sort of form of financial technology. So, criminals will use every technology tool. ISIS uses email, I'm sure, but in the end, there's nothing unique about this that makes it especially useful for those kinds of people.
So you talked a little bit about Sevi's example, and let's use, you or me.
Yeah.
If we use me as a content creator, podcast, creating on social media, writing a newsletter, one of the reasons a lot of us write a newsletter is because we've been taught that on the platforms that we write on, we don't own them. And so we're only renting our audience. So we need to take them off platform onto a platform where we have more ownership, being either a podcast or an email newsletter, as an example. And what you write about is that's Web 2.0 having failed the creators. And you see Web 3.0 empowering those creators. What does that look like for the people that are listening? How are they going to benefit from that aspect?
Yeah. So I think when we think of creators, we think of professional musicians and artists and writers and people who make a living today from selling their creative work. But actually, there's a much bigger group of creators, and that's basically everybody that uses the web. Everybody that posts a photo or makes a contribution to a social media site or uploads a blog or writes a newsletter, even if they're not monetizing it, is in a way creating value. They're creators who are putting things out there. And there hasn't really been a way for creators to monetize that value. And it's an interesting thing to think about. What is your contribution to Instagram or Facebook really worth? What's my contribution? Am I creating value to that platform, and should I get paid as a result? One of the most kind of compelling concepts of Web3 is that it turns internet users into internet owners, where people who use an application can actually become an owner of the platform itself. Now, this is something that is not experimental. It exists at scale in Web3 in several areas, most notably in the financial services sector of Web3, which is known as DeFi or Decentralized Finance, where a lot of early applications, maybe it was an exchange that was looking to attract users. Well, in order to attract users, it would pay them basically in the form of the token that represented that thing itself. So it's sort of like earning equity in something by being an early adopter. So I happen to be one of the first people that ever used Facebook, maybe not the first, but one of the first million or so, because my school just happened to be one of the schools that very year that it launched with. And, it would have been nice in retrospect to have earned something for helping Facebook to scale. Like Facebook relies on the social graph and the network effects that come from many users connected to each other sharing information. And in a way, the very early people who were using Facebook in those days actually helped to get Facebook to the critical mass where it became a really valuable social network. Now, I'm not asking for, options or something or equity in Facebook. I'm simply saying that Web3, in that model, it would have been very difficult to do that in reality. But in Web3, it's actually quite easy because all these new projects, rather than being, companies with shares, that are domiciled in some specific country, they're platforms that have tokens. So any user anywhere in the world who's early to using a technology or early to using an application can actually earn tokens in that platform. And so, in the case of DeFi, Uniswap, for example, the most prolific decentralized exchange, allows people to trade any kind of asset peer-to-peer, is responsible for 60% of all the trading volume in DeFi, is got a $3.5–4 billion market value, is owned by its users. So in the same way that we could build this for any kind of industry or application. You can build a social network. You could build any consumer-facing application where users who are contributors and creators can actually own a piece of the action. And that's something that's really only possible in Web3. If you wanted to incentivize people all around the world this way in a traditional model, like with a company and shares and options, you'd have to negotiate options agreements in 50 different countries and pay them out to people not knowing where they were, where they were domiciled. With Web3, it's really easy. You just you have a wallet, you use a platform, you get paid in the token. The token lands in your wallet. If it becomes more valuable, it becomes more valuable. If it doesn't, it doesn't. It is what it is. And that's a model that I think is going to be very, very replicable and scalable for lots of different kinds of applications.
And so when you talk about that, are we talking about DAOs or decentralized autonomous organizations? And so for the listeners, what is a DAO and how is it moving away from an LLC and ties into this concept that Silicon Valley talks about where we say owners care more
Yeah.
than renters or users?
Yeah. Well, I mean, Silicon Valley has had the model correct for many decades, which is that if you want to attract the best people and you want to keep them incentivized, then you have to give them equity. You've got to cut them in. And owners care more, as you said. If you're an employee of a business, but you also have upside in that business in the form of equity, you might work a little harder. You might be a bit more creative. You might collaborate, with others more closely because if it works out for everyone, including yourself. So in a Web3 model, basically, applications extend that model to all users and all contributors to a platform. And yes, it can take the form of a DAO or decentralized autonomous organization. Basically, a DAO is, you can think of it as sort of like an internet native company where instead of equity, you have tokens. And instead of a management team, you have a governance process where token holders get a say in how things work, right? So, if you're a user of a platform and you earn tokens in that platform, then you have an economic sort of stake in it, but you also have a say in how it's run. And I think that's something that is a really kind of compelling and fascinating experiment that is happening in Web3, which is, do owners care more, and will they participate in governance, and will they stick around in the long run through the thick and thin when the value of the stake of the thing that they own can go up and down, right? And that's something that is so unique about Web3 and so fascinating, which is that if you're a Facebook user, you don't really care what the share value of Facebook is, right? Day to day. And I don't think most people use Facebook care or know. But if you're a member of a new internet native community and new social network, but you also have a token, and that token gives you a say in how that thing is run and maybe some upside, well, all of a sudden your user experience is an owner experience. For better and for worse. I think that it's sort of, we don't really know how that's all going to play out. And when things are going well, everyone wants to be an internet user because you get to be an owner. But when things go down, they start to have a different perspective on that issue. And I don't know how that's all going to play out. But I think that, all things being equal, if you're going to use an application, you're going to contribute to it, and you're going to help it to scale, you might as well own a piece of it. It just seems like an uncontroversial and easy thing to understand for a lot of people.
Yeah, I love that idea. And I've seen some people who are early leaders in the creator community take advantage of that concept by having coins for their own business. So in essence, if I wanted to be a public company of Clint, it's almost impossible. But through the use of tokens or DAOs, I could create a company that says, hey, this entitles people who buy this token to X% of all earnings from these mediums over the next 5 years. So it allows an audience as well to take a bet on creators that they believe in. Is that something you're seeing more people do? Alex,
Yeah.
is effectively an IPO of one.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's one option. There are lots of ways that creators can use tokens to connect with fans or to monetize their creations. So it can be in the form of, a pre-sale of that creator's future art or something, where people have an economic say or a stake in the future success of an artist. It can also happen just by selling individual pieces of art or individual creations, where not only can an artist get paid once, they can get paid over and over again. A lot of NFT contracts and transactions involve like an ongoing royalty that pays the artist every single time their work of art gets paid. I mean, that's something that's really radically new. Like if you're an artist, if you're a starving artist and you sell your first piece for $1,000 and then it goes on later, someone resells it for $1 million, you may not ever participate in any of that upside. But with a digital asset, you can program it to include a payment paid in perpetuity, right? So every time a piece of art is sold or resold, you might earn 2% or 5% or 10% or something like that from the sale. And that is a way to ensure that artists have a steady stream of revenue going forward.
So let's shift a little. Let's talk about, you already mentioned this concept of DeFi. And personally, as soon as I started reading about DeFi, I became a bit of a crypto maxi in that I looked at things like the speed, transaction costs, the number of people in the world who are unbanked, in what DeFinance does for all of those areas, taking it off the Swift network, moving it on chain. Can you talk about 9 different areas that we can use definance in the book. Let's not cover 9, but what do you see as the top 2 or 3 things that are really going to shape how people see the importance and the power of definance that start to shift us in the direction of more ready adoption of these Web3 technologies?
Yeah. Well, they financial services is more than any single industry, right? It is it's the lifeblood of all industries. It's the cardiovascular system of global commerce, and the most important people and institutions in financial services get compensated quite well for the role that they play. But fundamentally, the industry performs 9 or 10 functions, which you alluded to, and I won't go through them all in detail. But to list them is pretty easy, right? It gives us a way to move money, to store money, to access credit, to exchange assets, to fund new investments, to organize financial information, to insure against risk, to analyze value, and to prove identities. Identity is a big kind of cornerstone of finance. And those 9 functions of financial services are all being reimagined with decentralized finance, or DeFi. And just to be clear, this is different from fintech or financial technology. Fintech, people can think of as a digital wallpaper. It is a new, sleek user interface that allows you to access the old world of financial services. DeFi is a new architecture. It is reimagining finance from the ground up, from those 9 things. A very well-known and successful banker, the CEO of one of the biggest banks in the world, once said that we move money. Because we move money, we get to store money. Because we store money, we get to lend money. And lending money is like our bread and butter. So if we lose the moving money part, well, then the whole thing kind of comes undone. And that's why I think that moving value, just that basic concept of being able to move money around the world in a purely digital format, is more than enough to justify anyone's excitement in Web3 or in digital assets. And it's early still, but there's a lot of obvious examples of this being applied at scale. And stablecoins are the most clear and present example of that. A week before we're recording this, PayPal announced that it's launching its new stablecoin, PYUSD. Now, PayPal's gotten, huge network effects, tens of millions of users and millions of merchants all around the world. But it also has the potential to create new kinds of overland and overseas payment rails to disintermediate what existed before, to basically, in effect, replace what they call the correspondent banking network. Because all of a sudden you have this instant, liquid, frictionless way to move value peer-to-peer. And so we moving money. Well, once you can do the moving money, then you can do the storing of money. Now, what's really unique about tokens is that they can be custodied by individuals. They can be self-custodied. So if you want, you can be your own bank. A lot of people like that, especially as I've alluded to earlier, people who live in parts of the world where maybe the financial industry is underdeveloped or where the government is corrupt. But a lot of people don't like that. In places like North America, they'd prefer to not spend their time thinking about how they're securing their money. They'd rather just leave it to someone else. So that's why I think that innovators like PayPal, who are pioneering stablecoins, and by the way, they're early for a traditional company, but they're late for stablecoins because there's all these other ones out there that are dominant in the industry. Like PayPal is the baby in the room compared to the other ones, but they have the advantage of those network effects. But by becoming the dominant, or rather by entering the fray and sort of putting their hat in the ring and creating this new digitally native form of money, they now have a way to store value on behalf of businesses and enterprises and individuals. And that's a whole new kind of stream of revenue that maybe didn't exist before. And then the lending value, well, they already do a lot of, I'm just talking about PayPal because they just recently announced. There's nothing special about them. But I'm just saying that this is a classic example of how a lot of companies who are quick to embrace this new digital toolkit, I think are going to be really well positioned for the future. Now, DeFi doesn't require us to have PayPal's involved at all. We don't need a company storing our money and lending us money. It can all be done peer to peer. But I do think the reality of how the world works is that lots of people are going to want the convenience and, the peace of mind of relying on a well-known and trusted corporation, right? And so I just think that creates business opportunities for companies that understand that and are quick to move on this.
In the interesting part with PayPal is when you look at where Elon's going with Twitter or X.com, he's talking about going to this everything app where there is money on it, where there is an ability to engage in commerce or transfer money or store money. And PayPal originally was back 20 years ago or so,
Yeah.
X.com.
Yeah.
And that's where Elon wanted it to go back then, to replace the banks and to store money and transfer money around the world. And it's taken them 20 years, but they're going to where he originally wanted. So I find that fascinating, Alex.
Well, it is so fascinating for a lot of reasons. The idea of creating digital money, a way to move value peer to peer, has been the subject of obsession for a lot of really smart people. Mark Andreessen, Bill Gates, Elon Musk, all of these people in the 90s were trying to figure out how to program money into the internet. Netscape Navigator was originally wanted to have a form of sort of digital money. There's this really influential book called The Sovereign Individual that a lot of people in the technology industry have read that talks about, the potential for digital money replacing fiat currency issued by governments and so forth. But what all of those projects ran into was this problem of trust, this problem of what they call the double spend problem. How do you ensure that when you move a digital asset peer to peer, that you can't send the same asset twice? How do you program digital scarcity? Going back to that topic I spoke about at the very beginning. And the missing link in all of this was a blockchain. It was a way to record data in a decentralized way that proved that when money is sent from one person to another, that it can't be sent again, that it can't be reversed, and that everyone can verify. And the only way that that's possible is with one of these systems. So that's why blockchains, again, are just sort of the foundational tool of all of this. They in and of themselves are not necessarily the big commercial innovation. They are just simply, the thing that makes it all work. I'm trying to think of an analogy in traditional computing, but basically without them, none of this is possible.
And so let's jump to metaverse. How do you see the metaverse tying into Web3? And what are some of the things our listeners should start preparing for and thinking about and getting ready for?
For sure. Well, I think that the metaverse is a much kind of ballyhooed topic. A lot of people are excited about it. It's had its fair share of hype cycles, right? Periods where people are really excited and then periods where people are not. But I think most people can agree that it's going to be a big deal economically, and basically just to define sort of what we mean, the web itself has been a two-dimensional environment for 35 years. We started by using desktop computers, then we used smartphones. And in a way, I guess if you take your smartphone with you, you're interacting with the physical world around you. You have added some 2.5D to it, but you're not living in a three-dimensional web or a spatial web, as they call it. Dan Mapes, technologist, coined that term. And the promise of the metaverse is that the experience of the web can be turned into a three-dimensional and immersive experience, and that we can have rich experiences and economic interactions and entertain ourselves and live full and fulfilling lives online in this way. I think that the reality of whatever the metaverse is today is really far from that. I think that first of all, what are we talking about? Virtual reality? Are we not? Are we talking about something else? Well, I think that probably to fulfill this vision, you need some form of virtual or augmented reality. I think that Apple's Vision Pro, could be a good first step in that direction. But I still think that the hardware needs a major upgrade before we get to that reality. But the much bigger issue before hardware is what kind of a world are we going to be creating online? Like, what kind of an environment is this? Is this an environment where we log on to Meta, Facebook's virtual world, where we are beholden to one company, where all of our transactions are monitored, where they're taxed, where fees are paid to the company that runs this environment every time a transaction is done, where we can't take assets out of that environment, where we don't own our data and our identities? To me, that's not a metaverse. That, the generous sort of definition of that is sort of virtual Disneyland, right? Where you enter into this virtual world and you kind of hand over your your sense of self and get fully immersed in this experience. And it can be a lot of fun, and maybe it's fulfilling, or entertaining, but it's not recreating the world. It's not a new sort of shared reality. It's not a new plane of human existence. It's just a new diversion of some kind. So if we want to create a virtual landscape that is similar to the physical world, to the real world where we live, then we need to start with the same basic principles and rights. And that includes the right to privacy, the right to property, basically, right? The ability to have a reasonable sense of privacy, and to be able to express your ownership of things and to be able to do with those things what you want, right? Like if I want to, sell my house, I can do that. Now I maybe have to pay land transfer tax and whatever. There's a government involved, and governments are important, but there's no company. I'm not paying Apple 30% every time I sell my house, or something like that, right? So that's the promise of the Web3 metaverse, is a shared virtual world where people have the same rights that they do in the real world, and where they can have meaningful and kind of purposeful experiences.
I love it. I still love the idea of augmented reality as an example, where we have glasses in your NFTs. Like a lot of people don't see maybe the potential in it, but if you have augmented reality and you have these video games where all these people are paying money for skins, Alex, for their characters, well, the fashion industry now, hey, we can put an NFT on everybody's clothes, so it just looks like a normal white t-shirt when they're walking around in the real world. But as soon as you have your augmented reality glasses on, it's a very specific skin that only one person in the world can buy, and we just sold that NFT for $1 million. The potential just becomes enormous, as long as we have, to your point, ideally not a company owned metaverse, but a decentralized metaverse that we're all able to plug into and enjoy together. What do you see as the greatest threats to the implementation of Web3 that we've got to be watching for?
Oh God, I mean, there's so many of them. In the new book, we've got a chapter on the sort of implementation challenge, which is in a way is sort of based on what we did the last time for blockchain revolution. When a new technology emerges, there's lots of reasons why it could be successful and many reasons why it could fail. And even really successful technologies sometimes never reach critical mass or reach liftoff. I think of we talked to Albert Wenger, who's a very well-known venture capital investor in the U.S. Union Square Ventures is his company, and he drew this analogy, which for me was really kind of perfect, which is nuclear power, for peaceful domestic energy generation could solve climate change pretty much. I mean, we could move all energy generation to nuclear. It would reduce the carbon footprint of humanity by massive, massive amounts. But there is no political will to build more nuclear power plants. And the reason for that is that there have been a couple of high profile, accidents, 3 Mile Island accident in the US, and then Chernobyl. And Chernobyl, I think, particularly really put the pause on nuclear power generation. I mean, you got countries in Europe who are trying to reach net zero targets and who are still beholden, to Russian natural gas sources, who are also decommissioning nuclear power plants. So the reality is not attached to the technology possibility. And maybe Web3, suffers the same fate as the nuclear power generation, which is we have this new toolkit that allows people to move and store value peer-to-peer, that allows internet users to become internet owners, that is going to act as a steamroller and flatten the world, create opportunity for people everywhere. But, if you have one or two too many blow-ups, so to speak, then maybe people are turned off from that. And, the last year or so, we've had a couple of companies that have failed in spectacular fashion in this industry. Now, companies, succeed and fail in new industries all the time. And there's no reason to think that Web3 will be any different. And in the book, I talk about lots of different companies that will probably end up as sort of footnotes to this transformation. And many of them will probably fail. And that's true for any sort of new era of technology. But the question is, will the collapse of any single project spell the end of Web3 adoption? I don't think so, but I think that the experience of other technologies should be instructive. And if anything, it should act as kind of like an organizing or rallying point for people to to grow and build responsibly, to onboard users to this technology, and to avoid those kinds of obvious pitfalls if they can. There are lots of other implementation challenges. Is the technology going to be able to scale to meet the demands of all of these different users and applications? There's questions about scalability within blockchains, which are being addressed, but just remain topics of conversation. Will regulators see the potential here, or will they react negatively? So far, it's a bit of a mixed bag, and we'll see how that plays out. There are parts in the world where some regulators are taking a more assertive tone and negative tone, and others where they're not. So we'll see about that. There are questions about how incumbents are going to react. Will big companies try to, crush this? Will they co-opt it? Companies adopting the language of the metaverse and trying to build virtual worlds that don't embrace the openness of Web3, that do the opposite. So is that something that we need to be mindful and vigilant of? Will users value the experience of, being internet owners, right? That's something that I think there's a lot of evidence that they will, from DeFi and other examples. But there's lots of reasons to think, some people maybe just want to use an internet service, not have to worry about being an owner, or that maybe ownership is one of those things that is like a niche within the market. Lots of people will. Maybe 500 million people will want to be internet owners, and in the sense that get to own digital assets and use them and, earn value in the platforms that they're using. That's a big market, but maybe it's about as big as the people who buy video game consoles, right? It's not every person in the world goes and buys an Xbox. So maybe Web3 only gets to that sort of size. Maybe it doesn't really fully become, something that is integrated into everybody's life. These are all legitimate questions, and in some cases, challenges. So you have to ask yourself, are these just implementation challenges, or are they reasons that this is kind of a bad idea? And I think that in each case, you can say that they're an implementation challenge, and they deserve to be addressed and hopefully overcome, because there's an opportunity to, rewrite the economic power grid and to build a more fair and open web, and to build, a more resilient and inclusive digital economy. And I think that's something that I think we should all be in favor of.
Let's put on our prediction hats, Alex. You talked about governments. We've got a number of big parties. Even having these parties come to the table and say, hey, we think we should have a Bitcoin ETF is massive. With BlackRock as an example coming out and saying, hey, we want a Bitcoin ETF. Where do you see that going? And any predictions on Bitcoin price over the next 16, 18 months as this all gets worked out?
Well, there are already Bitcoin ETFs in Canada. I actually know because I launched one, the Ninepoint Bitcoin ETF. It's a spot Bitcoin ETF. It trades exactly like any other ETF. And at its apex, when the price was higher, it was like $400 million of assets under management. So those already exist. But the question is, will one exist in the United States at scale? And that's really a regulatory question. BlackRock has filed for one of these things. They're almost kind of perfect in their record for filings. So we'll see if they're successful. But ultimately, I don't make price predictions, and I'm not really interested in the price in and of itself. I'm interested in it as it is a reflection of the growing utility and adoption of the technology. And so, I think that in the same way that, when internet users become internet owners, they start to follow the value of these assets. I think that, those assets will become more valuable as the technology is more widely used.
I like it. Good hedge. Good hedge. Okay, so let's jump into a final four rapid fire questions. Sure. To wrap things up, Alex. What is one book you've read that's had a significant influence on your life?
Oh, gosh, there are a lot. I just read a book called Papyrus, which is, I can't remember the name of the author. She's a Spanish woman who is a librarian and student of books. And it's basically about the history of books and the written word. And the invention, papyrus, refers to the type of fiber that was used in the very first scrolls that were used in ancient Egypt. And it basically tracks sort of the history of knowledge, the history of how we transmit information. And it's full of incredibly vivid metaphors that inspired some of the work in the book, actually. In my book, she says that libraries help to connect archipelago of knowledge. They weren't necessarily all encompassing, but they help to bridge to connect the dots, right? And in a way, I sort of think of my book as trying to sort of connect the archipelago of knowledge within Web3. My book's not exhaustive study of Web3 in the sense that it covers every single company and person in the space. That would be impossible. It's too big and too dynamic of an industry. But it tries to build those bridges so that people can have a proper understanding and can get from point A to point B on their journey, right? So yeah, that's one book I've read recently.
Love it. And I think it was Irene Vallejo.
Yes.
Does that sound right?
Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah.
What are you reading right now? What's on the shelf that you're consuming in the moment?
I'm reading a couple books right now. I'm reading a book called Maximum Canada by a guy named Doug Saunders, which, do you know that book?
No, just Maximum Canada. I mean,
Oh yeah. Well, basically the book,
gotta
I
promote
think the subtitle is like Why Canada Needs 100 Million People or something.
Oh, wow.
And basically about how Canada historically has had a minimizing force that has been pushing it down, whether it was like the colonial legacy or what have you. And that in the last sort of few decades, we've developed this, that we've had an awakening as a nation that diversity and multiculturalism and growth is our strength, is our most sort of dynamic. It's our biggest advantage in the world, and that's something that has kicked into high gear recently in Canada. And there are lots of reasons why Canada should have a bigger population, not least of which is we have a huge, vast land that doesn't have has a lot of sparsely populated areas. But more importantly, is that we can attract people to build businesses and create value and develop services and wealth and culture, which is something that is really important. So that's one book I'm reading right now. Another book I just started is American Prometheus, which is the Oppenheimer book, which is what the new movie is
great.
based on.
Yeah.
I haven't even seen the movie yet, but I've been hearing so much about the movie, and I was like, I got to buy the book because I usually read the book first, but I haven't read this one, so I've started that too.
Yeah, it was a really interesting movie. We took our two boys to it last week. It was phenomenal.
Yeah.
What's one thing you've spent less than $1,000 on in the last 12 to 18 months that Alex has thought, wow, I should have bought that earlier?
God, I don't know. Probably any book that I've bought, which is less than $1,000. I wish I'd read it earlier. I always wish that I've read something earlier, to be honest.
Good answer. What's one mindset shift, habit change, or behavior change that you've adopted in your life that's had an oversized impact for you?
Well, it's a cliche, but don't put off to tomorrow what can be done today would be the big one.
Yes.
My wife calls me a productive procrastinator because, I delay things and then they seem to work out. It's sort of like a joke in the family. But I've realized that actually by putting things off, I'm less effective. So I'm trying to push against my natural instinct to wait a day to do something and to try and get it done today. And I always find that makes you feel, stress comes from a lack of control. And so the more control you can put in your life, then the less stressed I think you're going to be. If you feel like you can make an impact, if you can do something about it, then you're going to worry a lot less about it. And that's something I'm trying to put into practice in my life.
Love it. And we went pretty wide. We went deep in some areas of your book, Web3. Are there any areas that we didn't hit that you want to make sure you get across to the listeners today?
Well, I think we've covered a lot. I think that we did talk a lot about creators, but it's worth kind of talking about it a little bit more, which is that for most of human history, technology has been a tailwind for creators. Before the industrial age, if you were an artist, you had to rely on the patronage of a wealthy, individual or institution, whether it was the Medicis or the Church of England or the Vatican or whatever. And technology freed people from that. It allowed us to sort of sell to a mass market, whether it was, books and manuscripts with the printing press, or art, the lithograph, or music with the record, whatever. But more recently, technology's got a much more checkered kind of track record. The internet, for one, took something that was an asset in the form of music and turned it into a free commodity that added new intermediaries to the value chain like Spotify. And now creators get paid less than ever. And now there's growing concerns that artificial intelligence, large language models are going to displace writers and screenwriters and creators in so many other fields, and that deep fakes are going to replace actors and so on and so forth, which is sort of central to the current labor dispute in the US with SAG-AFTRA. And I think that it's clear that with the rise of all this new technology, the culture needs a new business model. And I think that the only way that culture gets a new business model is with Web3.
Powerful. Where can our listeners find you?
On Twitter at Alex Tapscott. You can check out more about the book and pre-order a copy on Amazon or www.alextapscott.com. And check me out on Instagram, LinkedIn, Twitter, wherever.
Excellent. Thanks, Alex. Really appreciated having you on the show
Yeah,
today.
thanks, Clint. That was terrific. Thank you.
If you like the podcast, you'll love our new newsletter, The Growth Guide. Every Thursday, straight to your inbox, with the goal to help you be better, achieve more, and become financially free. Check it out at our website, thegrowth.guide. Subscribe and learn more.